Good morning and welcome to this webinar. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items. This webinar is produced by the Underserved Victims Population Training Project, a project of the Center for Innovation and Resources. Funding for this project comes from the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Victim Services Branch, with funding made possible through the United States Department of Justice Victims of Crime Act. For those of you who can hear me, this might seem obvious, but I just want to remind everyone to turn on their speakers in order to hear the presentation. Use the Q&A feature to ask the presenter any questions that you may have. There will be time at the end of the presentation for questions. You may ask questions anonymously by checking the anonymous box on the Q&A feature. The chat panel is where you can ask tech support questions. We will answer questions immediately in the chat panel. An evaluation will automatically populate during this session. Please take a few minutes after the session to fill out the evaluation. We value the feedback we receive from all of our training events. Now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Doyle Buckwalter. Doyle Buckwalter is a Director of Program Strategy at Chaddock, a multi-service agency providing a range of residential, educational, and community-based services for youth, birth through ages 21 and their families. While at Chaddock, she has been instrumental in the development of an innovative residential program for adolescents ages 8 through 16 with attachment disorders and complex trauma. One of the only programs of its kind serving older adolescents, Chaddock's Developmental Trauma and Attachment Program has served youth from 33 different states in the U.S., originating from 18 different countries. Karen's energetic and interactive style make her a sought-after speaker and trainer. She has presented at numerous national and international conferences. She has co-authored journal articles and book chapters, as well as articles that have appeared in Adoption Today and Fostering Families Today magazines. Her first book, Attachment Theory in Action, edited with Debbie Reed, was released in 2017. Karen has more than 30 years of experience working with children, adolescents, and families, the last 24 of which she has been at Chaddock. She has a bachelor's in Science and Individual and Family Studies from Pennsylvania State University and a Master's of Social Work degree from Temple University. She has completed a 2-year post-master's training program in the family therapy at the Menninger Clinic. So I just want to welcome Karen. I'm going to give her, if you guys will bear with me for a second, controls to put on her PowerPoint presentation. All right, Karen, if you'll share your screen with us.
Okay, I'm going to make sure that I have my things. Okay, we have it checked. Okay, all right. All right, I think I'm live. I think everybody's hearing me. So yeah, I'm really happy to speak about this topic because I think sometimes people think of attachment that it only relates to, a psychological need for closeness to a caregiver. And I want to emphasize here that it's also related to how we experience trauma and how we resolve trauma. So that's where we come up with the title, Attachment as a Source of Healing. So, what is it? I want to talk a bit about that. And one of the most important things to recognize about attachment as it relates to a talk about victimization or trauma is that the attachment system is activated in babies and children and even adults when they are fearful. So it's when you think there's some kind of danger in the environment, you seek proximity with your attachment figure. That is what triggers it. And of course, there's also positive things that enhance attachment, like playfulness and rocking and holding and singing and all the things that we do with our children. But want to point out for this discussion, it's activated by fear. And it does come about through nonverbal forms of connection. So attachment is formed in the right brain. So it's eye contact, movement, and rhythm that all establish attachment and not so much anything about words. And that's going to come into play here a little bit too. When we talk about trauma, We know that the language part of the brain goes offline also. So a lot of trauma work that's coming out today is using movement and yoga and Tai Chi and these kinds of things, using the body. So that right brain nonverbal piece is important attachment and in attachment, and it's also important in the experience of trauma and how it's experienced. That's where the old adage, too scared to scream, comes from, because we go very low into our brain and have difficulty with vocalization and language when we're terrified. So why does it matter, and how does it relate to trauma, is some of what we're going to be talking about. It's biologically driven for survival. So that is why it's activated in fear. Human beings are, out of all of the mammals, humans are the most helpless at birth for the longest period of time. So, other animals get, kicked out of the den or wherever much earlier, and they can survive. Human beings, babies, cannot survive on their own for extended, very long periods of time. And so that's why attachment has to happen, because they have to have a strong connection to a caretaker in order to survive. Because we need people to help us survive, all the way up through the teen years, some would say, but certainly far longer than other mammals. And I want to share two pieces of research in terms of how attachment provides resiliency, because we know resiliency is also a big piece here when we're thinking about people who've experienced traumatic events or victimization. The first one is research by Megan Gunner. And this is really quite fascinating. What she did was she took a set of babies that were assessed by the Ainsworth Strange situation, which I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. But they were basically assessed as to whether or not they had a secure attachment to their caregiver, and this was done with their mothers. So were they securely attached to their mother, or were they not securely attached to their mother? So those babies were put into two separate groupings, and then they went to get their shots. This is a way that is sanctioned in our culture, that we can do something that hurts a baby. And so what they saw when they looked at the cortisol level in the babies' brains, the babies who were securely attached to their mothers had a lower spike in cortisol than the babies who were insecurely attached when they got their shots. So this is data, hard data, and we have lots of other data besides this, but showing us that when you have a secure connection with someone and something hurtful or scary or awful happens, your cortisol levels don't spike as high when you have that caregiver with you. In other words, you're not as stressed. And that's how we're getting into this idea of the attachment system being a buffer to trauma. The other example I want to share from some of the research was from the London Blitz. So during the Blitz in London in the Second World War, children, and this is a picture, children were being sent out of London into the countryside to stay with relatives. And some of these were distant relatives or people that they maybe didn't even know that were friends of friends. The idea was that they wanted to take the children out of the city where the bombings were happening to give them safety. And so they moved them out into the countryside. Their parents stayed in London, stayed in the city, and they were sent, with these tags basically you see being put on them into the countryside. Well, what's interesting about this research is the children that went into the countryside where there was physical safety, the bombing wasn't happening, had more PTSD symptomology and difficulty after the war ended than the children who stayed in London and were having to go down into the bomb shelters. They had bombs going on all around them. They were in a life-threatening, unsafe situation. But what was the difference? They had their parents. They had their number one source of safety and comfort by them, even though all of this awful stuff was happening around them. Whereas the children sent to the countryside, they had physical safety, but they did not have psychological and emotional safety. They were with strangers. They were with people that they did not know. And this is why when I'm working with children in foster care or in situations where they've experienced trauma, I have to emphasize, you have to have physical safety, of course. You know, we think of physical safety all the time, but you also have to have emotional and psychological safety in order for children to grow and flourish, and certainly for children to work through traumatic experiences, and adults too. We have to have emotional and psychological safety as well as physical safety, and this just happens to be a study that really demonstrates that. So I want to share a little bit about the different attachment classifications and how they relate to whether children feel safe and secure or not. And I do want to mention, in case people aren't aware, the attachment classifications that are identified in age 1 by a protocol, I'm going to show you the strange situation, they persist into adulthood. They are not easily changed. So when we're seeing this, we're not only thinking of a child with this attachment classification and how that might impact their experience of trauma and levels of safety with caregivers, but even going into adulthood, we have other measures to measure attachment into adulthood, and this tends to stay pretty consistent over time, that if you were a child in the strange situation, which I'm going to show you here in a second, and your attachment classification was assessed at that time, it's very, very likely that it will remain the same as you become an adult. So we have different attachment categories. We have a secure attachment, insecure ambivalent, insecure avoidant, and disorganized. What I want to do is I want to share with you a short video that's going to show these first 3 classifications. I think sometimes a picture is definitely worth 1,000 words. So I want to show you this video here. Taking just a second to load.
This experiment, which I watched through a two-way mirror, is designed to gauge how secure is the crucial relationship between mother and child.
Okay, this bunny is going to go here, and that bunny will be on top.
The value of the test has been established in studies that would watch a child, 1-year-old, and then follow it up and interview them about their relationships to their parents when they were 21 years old. So we're quite confident in the long-term significance of this relationship.
Peter, that's Peter.
After several minutes' play, the mother is signaled to leave the room.
Sweetie, I'll be back in 1 minute, okay? I'll get you back in 1 minute.
I'm just upsetting for you. Shame, I feel. But she'll survive. The key moment in the experiment is the child's reaction to her mother's return.
Hi. Hi. It's okay.
The important clue is whether the baby's able to become calmed down by the contact with the mother, get back to play. Sometimes it takes a couple of minutes. But you see, when the mother was out, she was only interested in the mother, no interest in the toys. Now she has a contact with the mother, she's beginning to show a little interest in the environment, and shortly she'll be right back with the toys where we started.
So you would call this a secure one?
Yes, yes.
She's certainly much happier.
Goes to the door following her. Now, we sent the mother right back in. The point here is not to distress the baby. We're just trying to challenge it. The baby puts her hands to her face in a sad expression, puts her face down. When she picks her up, she keeps her head down, her arms out, and then she sits in the chair holding the baby. The baby's still sullen. He's low-keyed.
So you would call this insecure attachment?
Yes, insecure. He's avoidant. He's not engaging her, and the reunion's not effective. And it's important to remember here that the thing that upset him was her absence. Her return should be the solution to his problem. Now this is another pattern that we see in babies who are not good at using their mother as a secure base at home. This baby is also insecure. But you'll see, we got a look at his play before the separation. The mother's left. And when she returns, she picks him up. He can't calm down. He's still upset. She offers a toy to amuse him or to comfort him or to distract him, and he slaps it away. She offers another. He slaps it away. He's angry. We call these babies resistant or ambivalent because they both want her back and yet can't use the contact. We think that the difficulty...
I'm not going to have him say the difficulty because that's something I want you guys to think about here for a minute. So, so we saw these 3 different babies. The first child, I just want you to think about, what you saw with that first child. The mother leaves, the baby gets distraught, walks towards the door, tries to follow her. The mother comes back, picks the baby up, and the baby very quickly settles. This is secure attachment. The number one thing that we look at in this experiment, the Ainsworth-Strange situation, is the reunion behavior. So what does the baby do when the mother comes right back in the room? What you saw from the second child was avoidant behavior. So that child was upset when the mother left, but when the mother came back, he looked down. He didn't really look at her. It was as though he was trying to not care that she was back, even though it upset him that she was gone. And then the third child that was really whining and clinging and crying. So that child's upset when the mother leaves, but seems equally, if not more upset, as when she returns. So why do babies behave this way? And this is what is important for people to understand, because some people would look at this and think, well, the baby behaves that way maybe because they have a different temperament. One baby's more fussy or cranky. But what we know in attachment work is that the babies behave this way because of how they've been cared for. So the mother's attachment pattern will match the baby's attachment pattern. So when we saw secure attachment, that person, if they were assessed in their attachment classification as an adult, they would come up secure. One of the things I think is so important to understand about a baby with a secure attachment relationship is when they get upset, all they have to do is cry, and their experience is someone will come and take care of them. That's the experience of a securely attached baby. An avoidant baby and yet the resistant ambivalent baby, the second 2 babies, what they have to do is they have to think, what will my caregiver respond to? So they can't just cry and the caregiver, think only of themselves, like little babies should be able to. They have to think, what will my caregiver respond to? So the avoidant baby would have a dismissing parent. That would be a parent who doesn't like a lot of affection, really doesn't like when the child clings to them. So that baby has learned to dampen its response. So that the baby almost acts like, I don't need you, I don't want you, I'm not going to look at you when the mother comes back, because that baby has been conditioned by the mother to tap down attachment needs and neediness, because that's less comfortable for the mother. So that baby gets upset, and then they have to use a strategy. Remember, it's a survival mechanism. So they have to use a strategy that is the most likely to give them care. And if you have an avoidant parent, you're more likely to get care if you don't act so needy. And so that's what that baby's doing. The third baby, the resistant ambivalent, that would be a baby that has a mother very inconsistently available. So what that baby learns is, I need to fuss and fuss and fuss and fuss. If I fuss, 100% of the time, then maybe I'll get her to respond to me 50% of the time. But since she's really inconsistent and I don't know what she's going to do, I don't want to not fuss enough. If I fuss 100%, maybe I get her 50%. But if I don't fuss very much at all, I don't even know if I'll get her at all. So the babies are more fussy. And so I think this is really important in terms of what does this mean for trauma exposure. Because babies that, as we said earlier, the less securely attached, those 2 second ones that were insecurely attached, are not being able to use their caregiver for safety and proximity in the same way. They have to kind of act calm or act okay if they're the second baby, or they're being overly dramatic or overly needy for the second baby, for the third baby that we saw. And so this definitely does come into play in terms of resiliency. And if a child with an insecure attachment has a traumatic experience, they're less likely to seek comfort and protection from the caregiver, which means they're then more likely to have post-traumatic stress symptoms, which we know look different in children than grown-ups. They look like sleep problems and nightmares and anxiety and things like that. And it can be similar for adults in that they could see a reminder of the trauma and get anxious and fearful again. So here's just information about what I said. A securely attached baby, the primary caregiver is available, they're consistent, they're attuned. The baby knows something bad happens to me, I can run to you and you'll protect me and you will help me. So they have confidence about self, and they're confident they can find help in the world, and that the world is a really safe and good place. The insecurely ambivalent baby, the third one, they, as I said, have a caregiver that's inconsistently available, not always available for their needs, and the parent's own emotional upheaval will dominate. So these are parents that get very upset and very lost in their own problems and have an inability to then respond to their children. And in turn, the children show anxious, clingy, and whiny issues. And then the avoidant one, the second one, the primary caregiver is rejecting, as I talked about, and the child learns to suppress attachment feelings, suppress attachment behaviors, because it can trigger a parent's rejection. And you see with these second two, the ambivalent and the avoidant, we see that can lead to a child being anxious and having issues with depression. This one can lead more to addiction and covert aggression as the child gets older. So the next thing you didn't see a video of, but I'm going to show you a video of, is disorganized attachment. This is the #1 predictor. If we're just looking at attachment classifications, okay, we're just saying, what attachment classification has the most problems later on. There could be a host of other factors that come in there. But disorganized attachment is the #1 predictor out of all of the patterns of adult psychopathology. We also know that, looking at various studies, 70 to 80% of children in foster care have disorganized attachment patterns. So this situation is when a caregiver is frightening to the child. And so the child has to go to the same person for protection is also the person who harms them. So that is a terrible paradox to be in. The person who is to protect me is also the person who harms me. So these children have all kinds of stilling behaviors, If you look at them in a strange situation, they will go completely still sometimes for like over a minute, even when they're only these 12 to 18-month-olds. So they have dissociation, they have freezing. As kids get older, they can show intense needs for control, aggression. A lot of times, I think children that are being called reactive attachment disorder, which we know is not really a good diagnosis. We're thinking more about developmental trauma and complex trauma. Those aren't in the DSM. But anyway, the children that have attachment difficulties or reactive attachment disorder, they would be more likely to be in this category. This category where the person who protects you is also the person who harms you. I want to show you 2 examples of this. These are actually just YouTube videos. I mean, these are things that parents posted that they thought, you know, was just, you know, here's a video I want to show of one of my children. So I'm going to show you 2 different ones, and here we go. This is a little girl.
Thank you, Natalie.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Lauren, mommy popo?
Whoa! Lauren!
It's all wet too. There's like full of water. Lauren, you say sorry. Lauren, you say sorry. Lauren, you say sorry. Lauren, you say sorry. You say sorry, Lauren. Lauren, please say sorry, okay? You say sorry, Baba.
Sorry.
All right, that child is in a stilling dissociative state. The voice of the caregiver, that grumbling you heard at the beginning, sent her into this state. We know that certain, it's kind of strange, but certain noises that sound like animal noises from caregivers, you know, just like animals of other mammals, can trigger this. So we know that this girl somehow, we don't know the extent of it, but she's exhibiting a disorganized attachment pattern here because she is dissociating, because she's frightened of the caregiver. And when you're completely dependent on a caregiver and that caregiver also scares you, you don't know what to do. Like you're in this, some of the kids like turn around in a strange situation, they turn around in circles and walk backwards. Or sometimes they walk backwards towards the caregiver. So it's like, I want the care, but I can't look at you because you scare me. So they do a variety of different things in order to cope with this horrible dilemma that they are given. I wanted to share this just so you can see that this kind of attachment pattern can come up in what looks like, you know, fairly everyday life. That you might even see in a home visit if you work in homes. So I am now going to show you a second example of a disorganized attachment pattern.
Here. Here you go. It's okay. It's okay. Here you go. Here you go. It's okay. okay, it's okay. Mm. That's good, huh?
Well, I think you get the idea. These are very difficult to watch. What we have here is this parent is making a noise that is frightening. You can see very early that the baby is scared of this noise. And even though the mother is seeing him getting upset and cry, she not only doesn't stop doing it, but she starts laughing. So now he's like completely confused. Like, you're laughing and I'm terrified, and no, wait a minute, you want to feed me, but I'm terrified. And so here's this kind of paradox that we're talking about, that creates disorganized attachment. When children feel no safety in everyday interactions, they're not going to be able to work through experiences of trauma, because you have to feel safe, and you can't. You're making yourself vulnerable when you talk about traumatic experiences or work through them in therapy or go to somebody and talk to them. And these children are very clearly learning, don't be vulnerable. The first two children are insecure attachment, which is not as detrimental as what we're seeing here, which would be disorganized attachment patterns being created. So that is what I wanted you to see there. So let me go here. Okay, so these children are forming an internal working model of the world, that it's either safe and a good place to be, and I matter, and people meet my needs, and I don't have to be worried, or they're learning it's not safe. I don't know if caregivers will be available. They might not be. I'm not sure. I have to kind of strategize how I react in order to get my caregiver to care for me. And in the worst case scenario here, this double bind of this person that is trying to, scaring me, is who is supposed to help me with being scared. And obviously there's a big problem here. I also work with a lot of children that come out of orphanage care. And so this is, what is your internal working model, which is Bowlby's language, Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, his language for your view of the world. If this is your early experience, you can see the expressions in some of these children. Their view of the world is, people aren't near me, people don't talk to me, people don't meet my needs, I lay in wetness, I don't get my diaper changed, I lay here hungry, I have to eat on a schedule, whether I'm hungry, it doesn't matter, I get food when everybody else gets food, I have to eat food quickly, it's shoved in my mouth rapidly. They're constantly learning that the world is not a safe place, the world is not a comfortable place, the world is not a good place to be. So what I call in foster care is the double whammy of foster care. And I'm weaving some foster care into this because I know that's an area that some folks are working in. So what we have with kids in foster care is they're having repeated traumatic experiences without secure attachment to buffer it. So the reason it's a double whammy is because if they had secure attachment, that they would be able to weather these experiences much more easily. So if you were had great caretaking from the age of 4, from baby to the age of 4, okay, great caretaking, secure attachment with caregivers, and both your parents got killed in a car accident. you are going to be much more able, even as a 4-year-old, to deal with one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a child, losing both parents, because you have 4 years of secure attachment, 4 years of knowing the world's safe, 4 years of knowing caregivers will be there for you, 4 years of knowing you're totally wonderful and special. So if you have something happen to your parent while you've been like going around in foster care for several years, or you lived with your foster parent or your biological parents for a year or two in definitely suboptimal conditions, and then you're later moved to a foster home, and then you're moved to the next foster home. Repeated trauma, no secure attachment, the double whammy. Okay, I think this is important enough to read. I normally do not read from slides, but I just felt that this was so compelling that I'm going to read it. Our current mental health, child welfare, and judicial systems, as well as child-placing agencies, deal with traumatized and maltreated children as if they were completely unaware of these essential findings in development, attachment, and in trauma. We have few metrics to measure the number, quality, and patterns of healthy or unhealthy relational interactions. We move traumatized children from therapist to therapist, school to school, foster home to foster home, community to community. Indeed, our systems often exacerbate or even replicate the relational impermanence and trauma of the child's life. We expect therapy, healing to take place in the child via episodic, shallow relational interactions with highly educated but poorly nurturing strangers. We undervalue the powerful therapeutic impact and caring of a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, or a grandparent, and a host of other potential co-therapists. So I just think that that is like a really compelling thing for us to be thinking about and needing to improve. So the best predictor of the effects of trauma is not trauma history, but whether or not you can seek comfort in the arms of another. And this is from Bessel van der Kolk, who has actually worked in the field of trauma probably longer than any of us in many ways, because he is the person that advocated for PTSD to originally get into the DSM. He was working with veterans. He was seeing a consistent constellation of experiences they were having post-war, and he is the person that advocated for PTSD to be in the DSM. Again, though, he's saying attachment is a buffer. Attachment is a predictor of resiliency, secure attachment, that is. One of the, there's a couple interesting studies about this, but one was they looked at people who were in the bombings in the World Trade Center when 9/11 happened. So these were the people that did escape, obviously. And they looked at them in terms of the stability of their home life and symptomology from being in the 9/11 trauma. And they looked at other things too, but what they found was people that had stable home lives, secure connections in adulthood with a spouse, feelings of safety in their home and in their relationships, had less symptoms of PTSD. People that were also going through chaos in their life, who knows what, could be domestic violence, could be some other kind of victimization, whatever. Those people had significantly higher trauma symptomology, PTSD, from the traumatic experience of 9/11. And again here, we see now with adults that attachment is a buffer. All right, so I tried to move quickly so we would have plenty of time to talk about some questions. Let's see what we have in the Q&A, and I think Crystal's maybe going to help us with that. Is that right, Crystal?
Yes, I am. So
Okay.
if you have any questions for Karen, please enter them into the Q&A feature that you should see on your taskbar. Let's give folks a few minutes. Okay, so the first question was asked, can you talk a bit more about strategies to working with children who have experienced trauma?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to learn about working with child trauma is they heal in the context of the parent-child relationship. So especially the younger the child, the more involved the parent has to be, where I believe the parent has to be involved no matter what age, I mean, if it's a child. So I believe in dyadic work, even when you're working with older kids, 10, 12, 14. I think dyadic work, there can be some individual work, but I think dyadic work is very important to happen. The younger the child, the more heavily the parent has to be involved, because children heal in the context of the caregiver relationship. So, your client, when you're working with a parent and child, is that relationship. And the more you can help that parent respond with empathy, with comfort, with understanding, with consistency, with predictability, that is going to be the healing agent. The healing agent for a young child is not going to be coming and doing play therapy with somebody for 45 minutes a week. And then that's it. The healing agent is their most important relationship, which at that age is going to be with their parent. So whatever you choose to do, whether it's some sort of play therapy, whether it's theraplay, which by virtue of design involves parents, you need to involve parents in that. They are going to be your healers. That's what I would say to that.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what are the best things as an adult or young adult that someone can do if they have a disorganized, avoidant, or ambivalent attachment to change this? You stated that it was difficult to actually change this, but can someone's attachment change?
Yes, and this is going to make us in the field of helping services very pleased. This answer is because the number one way that this would change is a long-term stable relationship. So if it's in adulthood, we're talking usually about a long-term stable romantic relationship or therapy. Those are the number two, 1 and 2, a long-term stable relationship with a partner and therapy. Both of those move people from insecure attachment towards secure attachment. Those are the 2 things that are shown in the research over and over. Now, disorganized attachment is a little bit different because those folks are probably going to need some more specific trauma treatment. Not always, a stable relationship can be healing and restoring for them as well, but they may need some more targeted trauma or whatever that is, if it's TFCBT, if it's EMDR, but those other insecure categories, if you have a long-term safe relationship with someone, that is going to help that.
Thank you. And
whether it's a therapist or a romantic partner.
So we got a few questions asking what are some examples of good therapies or pastimes that can help kids heal?
What are some examples of
good therapies or pastimes? And other people said approaches for therapy. I think they're wanting to know if there's anything specific in therapy that will help.
Yeah, well, I mean, for young children, I think one of the best models is child-parent psychotherapy, which was developed there in California by Alicia Lieberman and Patricia Van Horn. And that is, you know, really kind of play therapy. It's not filial therapy, but it's play therapy with the parent and child there together. So I think that is a really great model. I think TheraPlay is a really great model. It involves caregivers. It helps the child feel safe, helps the child feel connected, helps the child begin to have sometimes words for what their experiences were. Oftentimes, I have started with TheraPlay because it allows me to pretty quickly, because we're accessing that right brain nonverbal experience, it allows me to pretty quickly form a strong connection with the child. So then we can move into some like other, so example, if I did delirium play therapy, I feel that it works more effectively when I've done TheraPlay first, because it's like that counseling 101, establishing that therapeutic rapport. I find to be done much more quickly through TheraPlay because it has movement and rhythm and all of these things, and not just talking. Talking is not the cure. So it's got to be experiential, and that's why we want the caregivers in there. I really love also what Bruce Perry says in that quote earlier, that teachers and other people, teachers and sports and places where kids can have a consistent, reliable, predictable relationship where they're enjoying themselves. I do think that we underestimate how healing and restorative that is. And, I have seen a lot of times where because of all of these services a kid has, they have to go to therapy, and then they have to go to, OT for sensory, and then they have to go to, maybe they're in foster care and they have visits with, somebody, and they're not able to even participate in a lot of these normative things. So I guess we could call that the triple whammy. You don't have secure attachment, you have traumatic experiences, and you can't do anything that all the other kids seem to be doing, like what seems normal, like there's with relationships in sports and coaching and things like that. So I think, it all has to come together, with therapy, with caregivers, and just with typical normal experiences. I think we pull kids too much out of that and try to therapize them just with therapists. And we have to involve all aspects of their life. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then along with what you were saying, someone asked if you could let them know where to find the quote that you read word for word.
Yeah, it is on, I don't think I can still move. Okay, so let me see here. It's on the bottom of that. Okay, here it is. The Power of Play, edited by Eliana Gill. Eliana Gill has fantastic work about working with traumatized children. You need to look her up. Sandtray, I think, can also be a really wonderful model in working through trauma, because, again, the child doesn't have to articulate it. We are too caught up in trying to get people to talk about trauma. Think about what I said earlier. The brain goes offline when you have a traumatic experience. That's why often, like a rape victim or somebody, they won't give a clear narrative. They'll say, I smelled this, I heard this, I saw this on his arm. It's a chopped up sensory narrative that people give. They don't get like a real clear story, because when you're terrified, your language, like storytelling part of your brain goes offline, and you're into a very basic sensory primitive part of your brain. So that's why some of these nonverbal therapies that access that are more effective for trauma for both adults and children.
Thank you. We had another question, and it was, do you think siblings, even just a year or two older, can provide the necessary attachment for a healthy attachment?
No. I think sibling relationships are totally different because they're not old enough to keep you safe and to make good decisions for you, and that you can just completely relax and know, I don't have to worry. My mom's here, my dad's here, my Nana's here. I do think that sometimes in traumatic situations, siblings get what I think of as almost like kind of a trauma bond, that they're weathering this together and they're surviving this together. It's completely different than attachment in the way I'm speaking of it here. Another pattern I often see in that is the older child becomes really parentified and a caretaker for the younger child at the cost of the older child. So, I mean, I do think, having another human being there, if you're going through something scary, is helpful, and a sibling would be an obvious thing, but it's different than an attachment figure who can provide that level of safety for both resiliency, prior to this happening, and then a safe container for you to process trauma afterwards. And I think that gets mixed up sometimes. So I want to really delineate those two relationships are different.
Thank you. Another question that was asked is, for children who are in the foster care system, how do we as practitioners safely navigate or facilitate that relationship between biological family and parent, guardian, or caregiver in the best interest of the child or children?
So that's interesting, because I thought you were going to ask, what do we do about foster parents? Because there's this myth that don't have them form an attachment to a foster parent because it's not permanent. And to that I say that's kind of ridiculous. What are they supposed to just put their attachment needs on hold until we figure this out, or what? So I think with parents, what I see a lot with like visitation and things like this is people kind of cocked back in their chair with a clipboard, watching these biological parents struggle in this visit. It's often in maybe in California, you have really beautiful visiting rooms and a wonderful visitation program. What I often see is, a small cramped room with a parent who already doesn't have great skills and is kind of overwhelmed, and that's how their child ended up in foster care anyway, struggling to visit with this child, and it's kind of chaotic. And I think that we have to be much more involved in visits. We have to really be helping parents learn to play with their children. We can't just the child has the attachment pattern that the parent has. Insecure attachment pattern begets insecure attachment pattern. If you were never played with, if you never felt safe, if you never felt connected, you don't know how to provide that to your child. I mean, you have no internal models or representations for that. I think therapists, visitation workers, I think we need to be diving in there and role modeling and helping and supporting and assisting. One of the things they say in child parent psychotherapy is do unto others as you've had them do unto others. We must treat the parents in the kind and nurturing, attentive, and even loving way that we want them to treat their children. Because many of them in the foster care system, many of those parents did not get that from caregivers, and that's why they're not giving it to their children. There's also a beautiful article called Ghosts in the Nursery, written by Selma Freiberg, and she talks about she's visiting this high-risk family. The biological parent is there, and she's not paying attention to her baby's cries. It's almost like she doesn't hear them. And Selma Freiberg and her two colleagues are wondering, what's wrong with her? She's just not responding to her baby, and her baby's crying. And they found that when they listened to the mother's own story, when they heard what she had been through, that was the intervention that made her hear the cries of her baby. When they heard the cries of the mama, she then heard the cries of her own baby. and not before, because she was caught up in her own traumas and her own triggers. And that baby crying was probably sending her into a dissociative state, or remembering things that happened to her or didn't happen to her, or things that she wished happened to her. So she was like really like not even hearing that baby, because she had so much of her own stuff that needed to be attended to. So, you know, that's a lot. The short answer is we need to be more supportive, more compassionate, more understanding, and doing a lot of showing and modeling and teaching, and not just, okay, we're going to sit back and like take notes about, you know, why that your child would terminate your rights. And again, you know, maybe that's not how anyone's seeing work done. I see that done that way across the country. Not everybody, but often.
Okay, thank you. A question was asked, how do we talk about parenting and attachment with families whose cultural background may lead them to lean toward one of the second, third, or fourth attachment styles without seeing it as traumatizing?
Well, I think, okay, so here's what we know about attachment across cultures. These same classifications come up at the same rates. So we see, you know, usually a little over half of a sample, like 55, 60%, I believe, will be securely attached. It doesn't matter what the culture. And then you have about a little over a quarter, more towards avoidant, and a little under a quarter, more towards ambivalent resistant. What does look different is how caregiving is given to children. So you may be from a culture that cares for your children really differently than another culture, but both of those ways allow a child to either feel safe and secure and connected, or a child to feel uneasy or afraid or scared, or like they can't come to you. So I think the trick here is knowing that you know, we're going to see these patterns, these classifications across all cultures. You need to understand the culture well enough that you're understanding how caregiving happens in that culture. So you're not trying to impose, you know, a white middle class way of doing this, because there's lots of ways that children are going to feel secure and connected. So I think I'm answering it a little differently than maybe because it was asked, because these classifications hold across cultures. What's different is what a caregiver does that leads to that classification, and that's what we have to understand. You know, what's typical caregiving patterns in this culture, and how do we work within that?
Okay, thank you. And our last question for the session is, do you have any advice for a CASA when working with a foster youth ready to age out or go to extended foster care, when child has no strong relationships and is even suicidal?
Okay, well, first of all, if they're suicidal, you know, we really need, you know, to get them into a safe situation, you know, a hospitalization, where they're totally safe and can't act on that, and need to get them to a mental health professional to put together some kind of plan, in terms of what's going to, you know, a safety plan, you know, that they are agreeing to not act on that. Okay, so we're going to assume with that question that that's all been taken care of, and that's all in place. And, you know, I think what I'm going to say is not popular. I think that we get so concerned about boundaries that kids like that end up with nobody, because they don't have the connection to family. And then all of us professionals are like, boundary issues, you know, we can't get overly involved. And I know we have to be aware of boundaries, but for example, I'm going to give you an example. I work at Chaddock in Quincy, Illinois, and we have a residential treatment program based on attachment theory. And a lot of our kids that are aging out, we're their parents. Like, we're who they call. Like, we don't like not take a call from a former client because they're no longer a client. You know, we're the people that are taking them out to the thrift stores, finding silverware for their first apartment. You know, we're the people that are doing the things that a parent would do. And I think whether it's volunteers, whether it's CASA, whether it's residential staff, whether it's somebody they know from church, we have to like step up and get involved in doing what they're not going to be getting from caregivers. And I think too much, I'm not saying we don't keep appropriate boundaries, but I think we can't hold back so much that this child then has like nobody when we're kind of it. So I hope that makes sense.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Karen, for your time. This was such an informational session. I really enjoyed it, and I know that the other participants did as well. I've already been getting some feedback, so I just wanted to thank you again for your time.
Thank you. I'm really glad I could be here. I'd love to talk about this longer someday. So I'm very passionate about this topic, and so I'm very happy to have had this opportunity here.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you all for attending the webinar. And just so that you'll know, it is being recorded and it will be available on the UP website shortly. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.